You should know this yarn actually says ISIS on it. It's very interesting, the point you're making, and I had to make this point in briefing in Washington, D.C. But last December, Al-Azhar came out and flat out said, we might not agree with what ISIS is doing, but you cannot call them un-Islamic. And the point of it is it's from the very political leaders, and by the way, I'm very bipartisan on this. I told you earlier, it was in 2007, the Moderate Muslim Brotherhood. That was Condoleezza Rice in the Bush administration that then brought the Brotherhood in. And so you could say things have accelerated, but that's just because we're on a geometric progression. But the other part of it is, everything that's just mind-blowing to me about what we're doing in Syria, we could show that McCain and Lindsey Graham were riding shotgun on. We could show that Corker, Senator Corker, wrote legislation to guarantee that this Iranian treaty would be passed by undermining their own authority under the Constitution to ratify treaties. And Corker's a Republican. So it's incredible. But the thing about spinning yarns is, if an entity like Al-Azhar says that they cannot declare ISIS un-Islamic, why are our people allowed to say they're not Islamic? I get attacked, you'll get attacked for pointing out what they're publishing and saying that you can quote. But the other side can go to their people where they're saying the exact opposite, but aren't they also relying on their view of Islam when they're saying you don't have a right to Islam? Because I will argue, if Al-Azhar says this, that they're not Muslim, you can't call them un-Islamic, then that answers the question, and it makes the President of the United States wrong. That's like arguing with the Pope about Catholic theology. Obama might have his views, but I mean, the Pope is the Pope, at least on the Catholic Church. And you know, people who are atheists, people who are not Catholic, you know, wouldn't have a problem with that. So why are we allowing us to get spun up on that? Something else very interesting to happen, and I just want to use this as a segue.
You can keep that.
Oh.
That's your thank you.
This is my, yes. I want to point this out. I was in Vienna, Austria last May, and at the OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, it's a formal diplomatic entity, of which Canada is a participating member. And the Russian got up there in a formal diplomatic event and made the argument that we should make it a crime to call the Islamic State the Islamic State. I want you to think about Bill 59 here and how serious this is, okay? And someone raised the question, but the Islamic State calls themselves the Islamic State. He said, that's not the point. The point is, if you call the Islamic State, you're perpetuating the stereotype that some Muslims want to kill other Muslims, and therefore it's a hate crime. Someone later asked, and this was Vlad put this on YouTube, Vlad Tepes, who's recording this event, put this on YouTube. Someone else followed up and said, are you saying that something known to be true can constitute hate crime? And the answer was, yes. You need to understand. How many people here have read Orwell's 1984? This is 2 plus 2 equals 5. And it's being imposed on you. And you need to make a choice as to whether you are going to say 1 plus 1 equals 5 or not. Questions? I think this whole thing is staggering to me. Because every time our people would go negotiate and say what they got, you'd hear the Iranians come out and flat out call them liars and mock them at every point down the line. I personally believe that the objective of the treaty discussions on the Iranians' part was simply to humiliate the U.S., not expecting they'd still get a treaty out of it. I mean, they've done that before. And I think that to show how low our diplomatic team was willing to go to ratify it is stunning to me, because at all points down the line, like you're suggesting, Iranians have made it clear they have no intention of doing anything that conforms to that. But you know, the thing about it that really bothered me is this. The language, basically, if you understand what the language is saying, means that we have to support them in their nuclear program against a foreign hostile attack, which means we have to defend Iran against, for example, Israel if they decide they have to take out their nuclear capability. Now, what I find stunning about that is this is not an agreement, this is not a future agreement to become a hostile actor. This is a current agreement to take future hostile action. And it's utterly beyond me, because I think this is was brought out. There's just something going on. The most cynical part of it was, I don't know how familiar you are with U.S. constitutional law, but the Constitution of the United States basically says for a treaty to be ratified, you need 67 votes of the Senate. This is being pushed in the international community as a treaty. Corker and somebody in the House, Senator Corker, passed legislation that said this is not a treaty. Oh, and if a president comes along and they want to get rid of it, they can get rid of it. Okay? And it's going to take 60 votes to keep it from passing, which is very difficult. So what they did, what the Republican leadership did, this is the most cynical thing I've seen in my life, politically, which is they gave the administration a blank check. They made it impossible for them to change it, so all the time they could be wringing their hands about how outrageous this bill is, how outrageous it is, knowing they short-sheeted themselves. I've never seen that, ever. So I'm one of those people who thinks if people think we're living in normal days, you're not. Things are going on. And I think people have to understand, something has happened. I actually was talking to somebody who was a former member of the three-letter agency, and I said, sometimes when I was on the Joint Staff Intelligence, we would wonder, did somebody say that they had hidden a nuclear bomb in Washington, D.C., and that's why all our decision-making's gone sideways? Now, that wasn't a serious discussion. We weren't really arguing that. But the question was put in a manner that says, even on the inside, we could not understand some of the decision-making going on. Yes, sir. On the Soros thing, I have to admit I haven't had time to do a deep dive on specific players, but as I noted early on, there clearly seems to be a coordinated media campaign to explain those events in ways that 100% of the people I know who are on the ground, and people who, I think even the United Nations reported 72% of these refugees are draft-age men. And if I'm wrong on that, I'll correct that later, but I heard that from somebody who I trust. I've heard that these refugees are throwing food away and getting in fights, fisticuffs, where there are more of them and are getting the upper hand on border agents. So when I hear that what's happening on the ground is not syncing up with what's being reported, and you see people in Vienna, Austria, for example, being persecuted for even saying something pretty neutral, but just kind of tipping their hands that they're skeptical. I'm not saying I know anything about what Soros is doing because I haven't had a chance to look, but I do think we're living in a period where we're watching a heavily distorted but unified picture of this refugee issue that seems to be oriented about creating a push to get people in here before people have a chance to understand what's going on. And I think that if you go to Europe, you're seeing that some of the citizens are starting to stand up and say, what the heck is going on here? What is going on here? And they're starting to say no. And I think that when it finally breaks through the media and you hear about it, it must be really bad. I know you had other question having to do with the Arab Spring. I was briefing before the Arab Spring that the Arab Spring was coming, and it's in my book, but I actually picked off the countries in the order they would fall, and I said it would end in Syria and everything. I, honest to gosh, can tell you, I briefed on Capitol Hill in 2010, everything we're seeing right now, except for the huge refugee thing, because I think in some places there are refugees. But I think what we're seeing in the organized effort is not. And it doesn't look good. And I guess I'm old-fashioned. I think people who come to your country have to obey your laws. I don't actually understand the countervailing argument. But that is the prevailing international view. And I think people have to get their hands around it. Well, yes. I came here for 90 minutes, and I could easily, and we talked about this, there are easily, on what she wanted me to brief tonight, 4 briefings. I didn't get through this one even. 4 briefings that I could give you to address that issue, one of which is the Muslim Brotherhood. And I have one that goes about 5 hours that brings that in. I give it to law enforcement so they can understand that the concept of abrogation is something you have to know, because you have to know that it ties in immediately to the Brotherhood's milestones process that was written by Said Qutb. Now I know everybody in this room is saying, what the heck is he talking about? I got that. Abrogation is the understanding that when you pick up a Quran, it's not in chronological order. It's written from the largest surah to the smallest surah, with the exception of Surah 1 being the Bismillah. Okay? So Surah 2 is the biggest, Surah 3 is the second biggest, Surah 4 in descending order. Abrogation holds that the things that were revealed to Muhammad later in the period of revelation supersede or overrule the revelations earlier in the period of revelation. This is important because moderates who advise us say, those crazy radicals, they're cherry-picking the Quran. How many people have heard that? Well, the thing is if abrogation actually is a doctrine in Islamic law and a form of understanding the Quran, and it is, okay, it means that the things said later, that control or overrule what things said earlier, would constitute, one, the authoritative final understanding of those verses, and two, cherry-picking to the authoritative parts of the Quran. So our moderate friends who tell us that they cherry-pick the Quran, I always find it interesting that if you actually parse what they say, they're never lying. They just know you'll never take the time to figure that out. So what happened was Sayyid Qutb wrote a book called The Milestones. This is a whole brief, a whole 2-hour brief. So I apologize if I'm cutting corners here. Sayyid Qutb, while he was in Egyptian prison in 1966, waiting to be executed, wrote a book called The Milestones, also translated as Signposts Along the Road. It's important because when you read Muslim Brother documents and they say we're marking the milestones or we're measuring the milepost, you have to know and like kick somebody, well, Steve, it could mean anything. No, they're pegging off the book Milestones by Sayyid Qutb. And what he said in his book was, how do we bring Islam today back to its purity? Because today's today's Muslims are in a state of what he called jahiliyyah. They've fallen into a primitive state. And he wanted to say, how can we bring it back? And his answer was, we must bring Islam back to this generation the way it was first brought to the first generation, the best generation, the Salaf al-Salih, from which you can hear Salafism. Salafism holds the idea that the most perfect form of Islam is that which was practiced by Muhammad, his companions, and the 4 rightly guided caliphs. So what the Milestones does is it basically says, we will introduce Islam the same way it was introduced to Muhammad through divine revelation from Allah. And when we see we get today's community to a certain point that matches the point where they hit a milestone there, we can go to the next milestone, the next signpost on the road. So that the whole way of bringing Islam into a non-Muslim country or reintroducing it into a Muslim country follows this milestones process. And here is the kick. You don't have to make a judgment on whether to write about abrogation or not. But you do have to know they believe that abrogation is absolutely set, and it is in the Quran. I use 3 different verses to make this point. They can give you 5. We only need 3. We actually only need 1. Okay? They quote it all the time, the Brotherhood. Okay? What you need to understand is to understand when the Brotherhood's talking to Al-Qaeda or they're talking to each other, or when somebody in the Middle East says something that sounds kind of flowery and it's in a following a formula, it usually relates to a milestone, and the Imam of a Muslim Brotherhood mosque in Oklahoma City can hear it and say, I can get my book of Islamic law, open it up, read the Quran, and understand that's a mission statement. Make sense? So what I'm trying to say here is, you don't understand Islamic terrorism, the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda, if you don't understand the milestones. And you do not understand the milestones unless you understand it's a direct inject into Islamic law through the concept of abrogation, which everybody we're fighting believes is true as a matter of divine revelation, not interpretation. We're not talking about your view, we're talking about their view. And when you realize they see it as a hard marker, you can analyze them with a hard marker and know where they're going by the language they use. If they're quoting Surah 2, it's early in the jihad period. If they're quoting Surah 9, that's the Surah of the sword. It's time to go to war. You could see that the Brotherhood sets themselves at Surah 8 with against them make ready. Well, I think that a humanitarian response does not necessarily mean that they have to come here. But I mean, let's just say that that is a possibility. I want to put that aside. I would argue that we're seeing enough going on what is being reported. We have seen things taken off YouTube that give pretty graphic evidence of what's going on in these borders, and that you're not seeing these bedraggled women with their little children. You're not. Sometimes you're seeing well-dressed young men who look like they're ready to rumble. Okay, and we can see a lot of that. Now, I might be seeing the wrong thing and someone's cherry-picking what I'm supposed to see, so I'll buy off on the possibility of that. But they are actually rumbling, and they're actually, because poor Hungary only has 50 security guards because they don't have a problem at their border, all of a sudden confronted with 1,000 people, they're in trouble. I mean, they're really, so I'm raising the specter that there's a national security question coming up on this. And half of it is what's going on those borders. The other half is, I'm putting this as a hypothesis because I haven't looked at it completely, but there's enough out there to say, are we receiving a disinformation campaign about what's going on? And I mean, I will tell you 5 years ago, and I was really cynical 5 years ago, I would never have said that something like that would happen. And yet you're watching what's happened, you know, like I was saying, I was with Egyptians in Cairo, and they were looking at this, and they're saying, why is this being reported like this in the West? Because I don't actually think there's a mystery about what's going on. I'm not having said that, I'm here in the West, so I haven't got a perfect picture of what is going on.